Going to try and keep it brief in the interest of time. I actually wanted to read some articles for you, but I think you can Google them yourself. If you look up a company called Transaction Capital, South African company, which is majorly when it was founded by a lot of Jewish business owners. A guy who was a CEO for a while was a gentleman by the name of Mark Lamberti. Mark Lamberti is the guy that took Massmart. It's owned by Walmart now, but Massmart from a few stores to becoming the third biggest retailer on the African continent. You know, when you think game, when you think macro, Dion at some point, Walmart came and bought all of that. I think included Cambridge and other businesses. Mark Lamberti was responsible for growing Massmart into the animal it became and became the CEO of Transaction Capital. And then he was to later hand over to David Hurwitz, who was the CFO, who's the CEO now. And part of the scandal that's happened is that David Hurwitz sold 40% of his shares. He claims it's 30%, so it's between 30 and 40% of his shares in Transaction Capital in December for 50 million rand. And this week, at Transaction Capital, we're finding out that they're expecting losses. And a lot of people are now almost sort of dumping the stock, and it's lost 70% of value as I write this to you in the past week. 70%. So now there's this question of, is there insider trading? Did David Hurwitz know something that we don't, and he decided to profit conveniently at a certain point because he knew this was coming? Or is it just coincidental that they're announcing that? And he's saying he doesn't understand why people are panicking, because they're just going to be restructuring some of their business models because they think because of load shedding and the COVID lockdown and those things that they're going to have an impact in how they've been operating. What's interesting about Transaction Capital, as I said, it was founded by a lot of Jewish business people or Jewish entrepreneurs, people that are in business corporates, so to speak. A lot of those guys, not a lot, some of those guys came from African Bank to come and set up Transaction Capital. And African Bank, some of you may know, it was the first black bank, or Dr. Sam Mutsuenyane and other people set up to be the first black bank in South Africa. And Dr. Sam Mutsuenyane basically says they were strong-armed into having to let go of the bank, and it ended up becoming Jewish-owned. And the bank went to shit when the CEO at the time, Leon Kirkinis, it was exposed that they had been engaged in reckless lending by the National Credit Regulator. The bank was not collapsed, unlike a VBS, the Vendor Building Society, which is a mutual bank. It wasn't collapsed. Instead, it was saved by the South African Reserve Bank. And today, all the big four banks have a stake in African Bank. It was saved from going under. It was a Jewish-owned bank. Leon Kirkinis disappeared. No one spoke about it. Some of the leadership, as I said, they set up Transaction Capital. Years later, because they grew the company to make, I think, over 40, 50 billion in turnover per year. Years later, here we are now, same company that's got similar guys and a similar legacy, talking about restructuring for loss. And if you understand Transaction Capital, you'll know that they are a credit business. Something that a lot of Jewish people all the way back from, is it Shylock the Jew in Merchant of Venice? That's William Shakespeare, where they speak about the shrewdness of Jewish people and money and lending and those things. And it seems they're still infiltrating, because African Bank was the biggest personal loans or unsecured lender back in the day. You've got Transaction Capital, which has had businesses like Bayport, which did financial services and the financing of phones. They ended up setting up SA Taxi, which is a huge fund of taxis in the country. And they also offer insurance, and they also offer, I think, some type of maintenance for SA Taxi. And then they bought We Buy Cars, which is arguably the biggest second-hand car dealership in the country. It was founded, I think, by two brothers or two friends, Afrikaans guys, majorly funded by Naspers, which is a beneficiary of the Broederbond, the Afrikaner bond from apartheid days. Naspers is big, became the first, I think, trillion rand company in South Africa thanks to the investment in Tencent in China, which owns WeChat as a platform. Naspers, because it became too big, went to list in Amsterdam a couple of years ago. For some people, they were saying, well, the Dutch are finally going back home. Big company, transformational. They've owned OLX and so many other tech businesses, led by the really, really brilliant leadership of Koos Becker at the time. So they bought a huge stake in We Buy Cars. They tried to take it up to 60%. The competition authorities came and they shut it down. Transaction Capital came in. They bought in about 50%. They're now sitting at 74%. And something interesting happened. SANTACO, which is the biggest taxi association in South Africa, was given a BEE transformation deal to own 25% of SA Taxi, which seems like a good deal, right? I mean, you're the taxi industry, you want to come in. But the first thought I think of is extortion. The taxi industry in Johannesburg at least forced government to give them a stake in Ria via bus services because they were afraid that it was going to chow their business. So it's like, you guys either give us a stake or we're going to collapse your business and your buses are not going to work. Now, is it a similar thing where the taxi industry is saying to you Jewish funders, if you guys don't give us a stake in SA Taxi, you're going to have problems? 25% stake, but when you look at the money they raised, which was close to 2 billion rand, big chunk of that was going to pay shareholders and debt of existing shareholders. So a lot of that money went to the people that already own shares. And now conveniently, how many years later, 4 or 5 years later, their share ownership in SANTACO is now going to go to shit because of now the structural engineering and the 70% devaluation in 1 week. And David Hurwitz says there's nothing to worry about. It's business as usual. There's no reason for a market panic. Anyone who studied the money game will know that there's something called the pump and dump scheme, which is actually legal from a trading perspective, where certain people with inside knowledge that have the ability, they go and they lie to the masses out there who is the market. And they either artificially inflate the value of a share and then sell it, and then it gets devalued and the people lose, or they artificially devalue a share, but they do that after they've offloaded their things, or it's because they want to buy shares on the cheap, and then when they get valued again, all of a sudden. These are some of the things we have to worry about. And again, these are shrewd corporates, business people, entrepreneurs who are behind this thing, and they're saying there's nothing to worry about. The taxi industry transports 70% of South Africans. We Buy Cars is a huge juggernaut, and Transaction Capital owns that. Are they looking to exit? Are they devaluing the company so that because they've already cashed out? David Hurwitz might be one. Mark Lamberti probably cashed out when he stepped down as CEO, I think in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe he made his money and he's good. And now the guys are going to move on to the next thing. And just like they did with African Bank, those of you who may know the Ellerines brothers, Ellerines story where it was furniture, they also engaged in reckless lending and they jumped out before the business collapsed. And you might see the same thing now where they pump up this business, Transaction Capital, because it's debt. And Transaction Capital, by the way, some of the businesses they own, when you look at the value chain of credit, they own the consulting, they own the people that get to evaluate who's good credit and who's not, and they own other spaces that offer credit. They literally, from a non-banking services, they were dealing in something called shadow banking, if you look it up. So they're like, let's grow this thing, let's make as much money as possible, let's cash out, and then let's jump ship. And the next sucker who comes in is going to find this Titanic that's sinking. And then, lo and behold, magically, there's a new company called whatever it's called now, which does credit, which is loaning out, and that's coming to eat Transaction Capital, African Bank, and any other credit institution in the country. It's Capitalism 101. Obviously, it will be called a conspiracy theory. And look, I can't say I have proof that these things are happening, but I try to connect certain dots. And because I know the history of how money moves, because I understand how ruthless capitalists work, because I understand how money flows and credit and those things, these are some of the things that people do. And I've said before, big politicians, big business are the biggest thugs and criminals in the world. Please go and research Transaction Capital. Go find the history. Go read up on Mark Lamberti. Read up on David Hurwitz. Read up on some of the people that came from African Bank that joined and set up that set up Transaction Capital. Look at the companies they've owned and what those companies basically do in the credit industry. And then read up on David Hurwitz selling his stake and saying, no, he needed to settle some debt, whatever the case may be. And then read up on what's happened this week, especially on the back of the Silicon Valley Bank, which has generally collapsed in America. It's probably going to get bailed out because that's kind of what happens. It's what happened with the global recession. The big boys get bailed out, but they get bailed out by we, the small middle class idiots out there. And they carry on making their money undisturbed. Read up on SA Taxi and their business and all the various components of SA Taxi. Read up on the taxi industry. Shout out to SA Taxi and the guys there. They've given us comprehensive information on the taxi industry that we've never had before. How much taxis make, how much taxis cost, the interest that people have to pay, the number of commuters, and go read up on SA Taxi. Read up on the history of SANTACO, which basically is almost like a mafia business in South Africa that was forcing transport at a time when the apartheid government didn't want to become one of the biggest black-owned industries in the country. But is it black-owned when a lot of black people don't own fuel stations? They don't own Toyota SA. Shout out to Dr. Albert Vessels, if you know who that is. They didn't own SANTACO as an example. And there's other taxi finance businesses. I think Bridge Finance or Bridge Taxi is another one. These are some of the interests we should be invested in as a country, getting to know how this country runs, who runs it, and what can we learn from a money capitalist perspective so that we can move better in some of our financial dealings. Paying you all the black pen. Cheers.